They called him the Mole of Bitter Creek long before the first flake of snow ever touched the ground that winter. In the high, exposed tablelands of the Dakota Territory, a man's worth was usually measured by the height of his barn or the span of his porch, visible symbols of dominance over a landscape that did not wish to be tamed. Ben, however, wanted nothing to do with height. A man of few words and even fewer friends, Ben had arrived in the settlement of Oakhaven with a distinct lack of fanfare, accompanied only by a wagon of peculiar tools and a golden retriever named Barnaby, whose coat shone like a singular coin in the dusty street. While the other settlers immediately set to work felling the scarce timber in the valley to erect drafty, vertical shacks that caught the wind like sails, Ben spent his first week simply walking the perimeter of the hillside he had claimed, head bowed, studying the curvature of the earth. He was looking for the precise point where the wind sheared off the slope, a lesson in aerodynamics he had learned not from books, but from years of watching how badgers and foxes survived winters that killed cattle where they stood. The townspeople found his behavior baffling, bordering on offensive. To them, a house was a structure of wood and nails, standing proud against the horizon. Ben's plan, which he kept largely to himself until the digging began, was an affront to their architectural sensibilities. He intended to sink his home into the south-facing slope of the hill, utilizing the earth itself as both wall and insulation. It was a concept as old as humanity, yet in the fervor of the westward expansion, it had been forgotten in favor of rapid, flimsy construction. Ben stood on the ridge, the relentless prairie wind tugging at the brim of his hat, and watched Barnaby dig a shallow divot in the dirt to lie down. "Smart boy," Ben murmured, observing how the dog instinctively sought the thermal stability of the ground. The wind howled past them, stealing the heat from the air, but down in the dirt the temperature remained constant. That was the principle Ben would bet his life on, the concept of thermal mass. While the air temperature in this region could swing from 50 degrees to 20 below zero in 12 hours, the earth 6 feet down held a steady, unshakable temperature of 55 degrees, regardless of the fury above. The mockery began in earnest the day Ben broke ground. It was a Tuesday, the sky a deceptive, brilliant blue that belied the turning season. He wasn't building a foundation. He was excavating a scar into the hillside. Thaddeus Thorne, the town's wealthiest cattleman and self-appointed civic leader, rode out with a small entourage to inspect the gopher hole. Thorne, a man who believed in conquering nature rather than cooperating with it, sat high on his horse, casting a long shadow over Ben's labor. "I've seen men dig their own graves before, Ben," Thorne announced, his voice booming for the benefit of his chuckling companions. "But usually they wait until they're dead to climb inside." Ben didn't look up from his work. He was rhythmically driving a heavy iron spade into the compacted soil, the sound a dull, repetitive thud that seemed to keep time with the beating of a heart. He paused only to wipe the grit from his forehead, leaning on the handle. "Wind can't knock over what doesn't stand up, Thaddeus," Ben said, his voice flat and unbothered. "Wind ain't the problem, you fool," Thaddeus countered, gesturing to the open pit. "The damp will rot your lungs. You'll be frozen stiff or drowned in mud by January. This is civilized country now. We build up, not down." The men laughed, a harsh sound that carried easily in the thin air. Barnaby, sensing the hostility, rose from his spot near the wheelbarrow and let out a low, rumbling growl, but Ben rested a calming hand on the dog's head. He knew that arguing physics with a man like Thorne was like trying to explain calculus to a mule. Thorne rode off, confident in his timber-framed mansion down in the valley, a structure built with single-walled pine that leaked heat like a sieve. Ben watched them go, then turned his eyes back to the soil. He wasn't just digging a hole, he was engineering a survival system. He understood the frost line, the depth to which the groundwater in the soil would freeze. He had to go below it. If he didn't, the expansion of freezing water in the soil would crush his walls inward. He needed to go deep, and he needed to do it before the ground hardened into iron. The excavation process was a grueling testament to human endurance and mechanical advantage. For 3 weeks, Ben became a machine of leverage and muscle. He wasn't merely removing dirt, he was harvesting it. The soil he removed wasn't discarded, but was carefully sifted and piled for later use. He cut into the hill in a U-shape, creating a sheltered courtyard that would catch the low winter sun. The work was slow, agonizingly so. Every cubic foot of earth weighed nearly 100 pounds, and he moved tons of it, day after day, from dawn until the light failed. Barnaby was his constant shadow, moving with him, occasionally digging enthusiastically alongside his master, though his contributions were more morale-boosting than structural. The deeper they went, the quieter the world became. At a depth of 4 feet, the whistling of the prairie wind was severed, replaced by a damp, hushed silence. It was here, in this silence, that Ben felt the first vindication of his theory. Even as the autumn air nipped at his ears above the rim of the pit, down here the air was still and temperate. Ben began the structural reinforcement using native stone he had pried from the creek bed miles away, hauling it back wagon load by wagon load. He wasn't using mortar in the traditional sense. He was using a mixture of clay, sand, and straw, cob, that would cure into a substance nearly as hard as concrete. He laid the stones with the precision of a jeweler, ensuring that the back wall, the one pressed against the hillside, was curved outward. This arch shape was crucial. It converted the immense lateral pressure of the earth pressing in on the room into compressive force that actually strengthened the wall rather than buckling it. A flat wall would have collapsed under the weight of the wet spring soil, but the arch would hold. As he worked, placing stone upon stone, his hands grew rough and calloused, his fingernails permanently stained with the gray clay of the creek. The neighbors continued to pass by on the road below, shaking their heads at the mud hut, unaware that Ben was building a fortress that utilized the very weight of the world to hold itself together. By late October, the shell of the shelter was complete, and the town of Oakhaven was busy with its own preparations. The difference in philosophy was stark. In the valley, the sounds of hammers and saws were incessant as men nailed up thin cedar clapboards and hoped for the best. They bought cast-iron stoves that consumed wood at a voracious rate, relying on active heating to combat the cold. Ben, conversely, was focused on passive retention. He constructed the roof of his shelter using thick, rough-hewn timbers felled from the dead wood of a lightning strike years prior. Across these beams he didn't lay shingles. Instead, he laid down a layer of woven willow branches, followed by a heavy canvas tarp he had waterproofed with beeswax and tallow. On top of this, he shoveled 2 feet of the earth he had excavated earlier, planting native prairie grass sod on the very top. To the untrained eye, it looked like he was burying himself alive. Thaddeus Thorne made one final visit as Ben was fitting the heavy oak door into the frame. The door was small, requiring a man to stoop to enter, a design choice to minimize heat loss, an airlock for the frontier. Thorne looked at the sod roof, already turning brown with the season, and scoffed. "You're living like a badger, Ben. It's a disgrace to the community. When the heavy snows come, that roof will cave in and crush you flat." Ben looked up, verifying the pitch of the roof with a plumb line. "The truss geometry can support 4,000 pounds of static load, Thaddeus. The snow acts as an insulator, not just a weight. Every foot of snow is like adding another blanket." Thorne just spat on the ground. "Physics don't mean much when you're suffocating. Don't expect us to dig you out." Ben watched him leave, feeling a pang of pity rather than anger. Thorne was fighting the winter. Ben was inviting it to wrap around him. He checked the seal on the door again. It was airtight. The interior of the shelter was a marvel of functional minimalism and engineering foresight. The floor was not wood, which would rot, but packed earth sealed with linseed oil until it gleamed like leather. At the back of the room, built into the thermal mass of the stone wall, was a small, efficient masonry heater, a Russian stove design that Ben had read about in a heavy engineering tome years ago. Unlike the pot-bellied stoves in town that sent 80% of their heat up the chimney, this masonry heater possessed a labyrinth of internal flues. The smoke from a small fire would wind its way through the stone mass, transferring almost all its heat into the rocks before exiting. Once heated, the stones would radiate warmth for 24 hours. He had also installed a ventilation shaft, a wooden pipe that ran from the floor level up through the roof, utilizing the stack effect to draw stale air out while pulling fresh air in through a regulated vent near the door. It was a breathing lung of a house. As November bled into December, the atmosphere on the plains began to shift. The sky lost its depth, flattening into a sheet of hard, bruised steel. The wind changed its song, dropping an octave to a low, mournful moan that vibrated in the teeth. Barnaby stopped chasing rabbits. The dog stayed close to the shelter's entrance, his nose twitching, smelling things in the air that humans had lost the capacity to detect. The barometric pressure was plunging. Ben could feel it in his joints, a dull ache that signaled a massive inversion. In town, the activity was frantic but superficial. People chopping extra wood, securing shutters, buying flour. They were preparing for a storm, a standard winter squall. They were not preparing for a meteorological anomaly. Ben, observing the frantic scudding of the clouds from the safety of his dugout entrance, knew the difference. He watched the birds. They weren't just seeking cover, they were vanishing, fleeing south or burrowing deep. The morning the storm began, the sun didn't truly rise. The world simply transitioned from black to a sickly, luminescent gray. The air was unnervingly still, a vacuum waiting to be filled. Ben stood outside one last time, checking the wind deflector he had built around the chimney cap. It was a simple, angled piece of tin, designed to use the wind's own velocity to create a low-pressure zone that would suck smoke out of the chimney, preventing a downdraft. In the distance, he saw the smoke rising vertically from Thaddeus Thorne's mansion, a straight white line climbing into the sullen sky. It was a sign of the calm before the violence. Ben called Barnaby, who bolted into the shelter without hesitation. With a heavy thud, Ben closed the thick oak door and dropped the crossbar into place. The silence inside was instant and profound. Outside, the first gust hit the valley floor with the force of a derailment, kicking up a wall of white dust. The town of Oak Haven was about to learn that tradition is no shield against the wrath of the high plains, and that the man they mocked had built the only lifeboat in a sea of ice. The storm did not merely arrive, it descended with the weight of a collapsing mountain. Within 2 hours, the visual world had ceased to exist, replaced by a screaming white void that erased all sense of direction, depth, and time. The wind velocity tore across the plains at 60 miles per hour, carrying ice crystals that were not flakes, but microscopic shards of diamond-hard water, capable of scouring paint from wood and freezing flesh in minutes. Inside the dugout, however, the sensation was disorienting in its tranquility. The only indication of the violence outside was the low, resonant vibration of the heavy timber roof beams, a humming sound like a plucked cello string that signaled the immense pressure of the wind shear passing over the hill. Ben sat in his rocking chair, a book of agricultural essays open on his lap, while Barnaby slept soundly near the masonry heater. The thermometer on the wall read a steady 62 degrees. This was the triumph of thermal inertia. The millions of tons of earth surrounding them were not just dirt, they were a battery, storing the solar heat of the previous summer and slowly releasing it back into the room. While the external temperature plummeted to 30 below zero, the frost line could only penetrate a few inches into the sod roof. The fire in the masonry stove had burned down to coals hours ago, yet the massive stone structure continued to radiate a gentle, pervasive warmth that soaked into the bones, a stark contrast to the uneven, scorching heat of the cast iron stoves the townspeople used. Ben reached out to touch the stone wall. It was cool, but not cold. It was the temperature of the living earth. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the steam rising in a lazy spiral, undisturbed by draughts. 3 miles away, down in the valley, the situation in Oakhaven had devolved from concern to catastrophe. The storm had exposed the fatal flaw in the settlers' architectural philosophy. They had built for the eye, not the element. Thaddeus Thorne's grand Victorian house was groaning under the assault. The timber frame, contracting violently in the sub-zero cold, popped and cracked like pistol shots, terrifying the family huddled in the parlor. The single-pane glass windows, beautiful in the summer, were now sheets of ice on the inside, transmitting the exterior cold directly into the room via conduction. Worse, the wind was driven with such force that it found every microscopic gap in the clapboard siding. This was the phenomenon of air infiltration. The house was hemorrhaging heat faster than the massive wood stove could generate it. Thaddeus was feeding the fire frantically, shoving split oak logs into the maw of the iron beast, but the physics were against him. The high winds created a pressure differential that sucked the heat right up the chimney before it could radiate into the room, a process known as the stack effect gone wrong. The floorboards were freezing. The water in the wash basin had turned to a solid block of ice. Fear, cold and sharp, began to settle in Thaddeus's chest, heavier than the snow piling up against his door. He realized with a dawning horror that the woodpile on the porch was inaccessible. The door had frozen shut, fused by ice and the drift that was already 5 feet high. They were trapped in a beautiful wooden coffin that was slowly equalizing with the outside temperature. By the 4th day, the storm had technically passed, but it left behind a landscape so alien it resembled the surface of a dead moon. The silence was absolute. The wind had sculpted the snow into drifts that were 12 feet high in places, hard enough to walk on without sinking. Inside the shelter, Ben awoke to a strange, muffled light filtering through the snow that covered his skylight. He checked his air quality first, a habit of the underground dweller. The flame of his lantern burned bright and steady, indicating good oxygen levels. The ventilation shaft had done its job, utilizing the temperature difference to keep the air cycling even when buried. He ate a simple breakfast of dried venison and biscuits, sharing a portion with Barnaby, who was pacing with pent-up energy. It was time to surface. Ben dressed in layers of wool and oiled canvas, wrapping a scarf around his face. He didn't just open the door, he had to dig his way out. He had designed the door to open inward for this precise reason. Had it opened outward, the weight of the snow would have sealed them in. He shoveled the snow into the entryway, packing it down until he breached the surface. The light was blinding. The sun reflected off the crystalline expanse with a glare that seared the eyes. He squinted, scanning the valley. It was a white wasteland. Chimneys were barely visible. There was no smoke rising from Thaddeus Thorne's house. No smoke rising from anywhere. Ben moved with the methodical urgency of a man who understands the physiology of hypothermia. He didn't run. Running caused sweat, and sweat in this cold was a death sentence. He strapped on snowshoes he had fashioned from ash wood and rawhide, distributing his weight over the crust. He hitched Barnaby to a small, flat-bottomed sled loaded with blankets, dry kindling, and a thermos of hot broth. They moved towards the town, a solitary pair of dark figures against the blinding white. As they approached the Thorne residence, the scale of the disaster became clear. The snow had drifted up to the second-story eaves. The house was dark, silent. Ben used a frantic energy to shovel out the upper window, smashing the glass with the handle of his spade. He climbed inside, Barnaby whining below. The air inside was colder than the dugout, a stagnant, deadly freeze. He found Thaddeus and his wife huddled under a mountain of quilts on the parlor floor, their skin waxy and pale, their breathing shallow. The fire was dead. The wood box was empty. "Thaddeus," Ben said, his voice rough from disuse. The man's eyes fluttered open, glassy and uncomprehending. He tried to speak, but his jaw was too stiff. Ben didn't waste time with, "I told you so." He wasted no time with words at all. He wrapped them in the warm blankets from the sled, forcing the warm broth between their cracked lips. It was a rescue operation based on thermodynamics. Stop the heat loss, introduce a heat source. The next 6 hours were a blur of grueling physical labor. Ben, the outcast, the mole, became the lifeline of Oakhaven. He couldn't carry everyone, so he did the only thing that made sense. He brought them to the heat. One by one, and then in pairs, he ferried the freezing neighbors up the hill to the dugout. It was a surreal procession. The people who had mocked the hole in the ground now crawled into it with tears of gratitude freezing on their cheeks. When Thaddeus was finally lowered into the shelter, the shock of the warmth hit him like a physical blow. The air inside was 70 degrees. The masonry heater, still radiating from the fire Ben had stoked days ago, felt like a living thing. The room was crowded, smelling of wet wool and unwashed bodies, but it smelled of life. 20 people were packed into the small space, shoulder to shoulder. Ben stood near the door, regulating the airflow, while Barnaby navigated the sea of legs, offering licks to frozen hands. Thaddeus, wrapped in a blanket, looked at the curved stone walls, the dry dirt floor, the heavy timber roof that held up the mountain of snow above them. He looked at the thermometer. He looked at Ben, who was quietly sharpening a knife to cut more cheese for the group. It's warm," Thaddeus whispered, the realization shattering his worldview. "The ground, it held the heat." Ben didn't look up. "Physics usually does, Thaddeus. It's reliable that way." The great blizzard of 1888 changed the face of the territory forever, but nowhere more so than in Oakhaven. The thaw that spring revealed the wreckage of the town. Roofs collapsed under snow load, pipes burst, foundations cracked by frost heave. But the dugout on the hill remained pristine, the grass on its roof turning a lush green as the snow melted, fed by the moisture. The mockery died with the storm. In the years that followed, the architecture of the town began to shift. It was a slow evolution, born of necessity and humility. Men started banking earth against the north walls of their homes. Stone foundations went deeper, below the frost line. The bin stove, a localized version of the masonry heater, became a standard feature in every new construction. Thaddeus Thorne never rebuilt his Victorian mansion as it was. He lowered the profile, used stone from the creek, and asked Ben to consult on the ventilation. Ben never became the mayor, nor did he become a socialite. He remained on his hill, watching the seasons turn, content in his solitude. But he was no longer the mole. To the children who grew up in warm houses that didn't creak in the wind, he was the man who understood the earth. And when he eventually passed, decades later, they didn't bury him in the cemetery in the valley. They buried him on the ridge, facing south, wrapped in the earth he had respected enough to listen to. His legacy wasn't a statue or a plaque. It was the fact that the town survived the next winter, and the one after that, because they finally learned that to survive the storm, you don't fight the wind, you let it pass over you.